Case 1. The Nola Dinkins case, the fake Amber Alert killers. In June 2025, the sound of an Amber Alert pierced the night across Delaware and Maryland. Phones buzzed, sirens echoed, and screens flashed the words every parent fears most. A 3-year-old girl kidnapped at gunpoint. Her name was Nola Dinkins. For a few frantic hours, entire communities united, sharing her photo, praying for her safety, and believing a violent stranger had stolen an innocent child. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states mobilized, roads were blocked, helicopters swept over tree lines, and the FBI joined the desperate search. To the public, this was the nightmare that keeps parents awake at night. But behind the terror and chaos lay a truth far more chilling. Nola was never kidnapped. She wasn't taken by a masked gunman. The real danger had always been inside her home. The woman crying on the phone for help, her mother, Darian Linnell Randall, was the one who had killed her. And standing beside her was her boyfriend, Cedric Antoine Britton, the man who helped hide the truth. Nola was just 3 years old, bright and curious, a child whose laughter could fill a room. Her life had barely begun when anger, frustration, and cruelty ended it. Behind the walls of their Cecil County home, Randall lost control. She confessed to striking her daughter with a belt 15 to 20 times until the little girl stopped breathing. She claimed she tried CPR but didn't call 911. Instead, she wrapped Nola's tiny body in plastic, placed her in a suitcase, and drove to Britton's home. What followed wasn't panic or remorse, it was calculation. Together, the two adults decided to conceal the crime rather than face the truth. Hours later, Randall drove to Delaware, creating an elaborate story designed to deflect suspicion. She told police that while she was parked at a shopping plaza, a masked man pulled a gun on her and kidnapped her daughter from the back seat. Her performance was convincing enough to trigger a full-scale Amber Alert, drawing in resources, manpower, and the compassion of thousands. Yet almost immediately, detectives began noticing cracks. Surveillance footage didn't match her claims. Witnesses saw no abduction, no SUV, no gunman. Investigators traced Randall's movements back to Maryland, to the home she shared with Britton, and what they found there destroyed the illusion completely. Inside Britton's vehicle, officers discovered a child-sized blanket stained with blood. In the trash, gloves and wipes showed traces of attempted cleanup. Surveillance video from the home revealed a heartbreaking clue: Randall leaving the house alone, with Nola never seen again. The supposed kidnapping was a lie, and the story that had gripped 2 states turned overnight into a homicide investigation. When detectives confronted Britton, he broke. He admitted that Randall had killed Nola and that he had helped move the body. He told them where they could find her. Guided by his directions, police searched a vacant lot in northeast Maryland. There, hidden beneath brush, they found a small suitcase. Inside was the body of little Nola Dinkins, wrapped in plastic, discarded like something to be forgotten. It was a discovery that broke even the most hardened investigators. Detectives described the moment with visible emotion. Seasoned officers wept. The Amber Alert was canceled, replaced by a homicide announcement, and the story that had begun as a public cry for help ended in collective heartbreak. Randall confessed to everything. She admitted that anger drove her to the beating and fear pushed her to the lie. Britton, who had tried to perform CPR, helped cover up the death instead of calling for help. He later provided investigators with the map that led to Nola's body. Both were arrested and held without bond. Randall faces 11 charges, including first and second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. Britton faces accessory charges and counts of child abuse and failure to report. Randall was extradited from Delaware to Maryland in September 2025, appearing before Judge Robert Sentman, who ordered her continued detention. Prosecutors revealed an additional layer to the story: a years-long custody dispute between Randall and Nola's biological father. Months before the murder, Randall had reluctantly agreed to share custody. Investigators now believe the decision to kill Nola was tied to control, not rage alone. It was a final, twisted act of power. To the world, it looked like panic. To detectives, it was deliberate. At vigils held in both Delaware and Maryland, candles flickered beneath Nola's smiling photos. Her family described her as pure joy, a happy little girl who loved dancing and cartoons. They mourned not only her death, but the unimaginable betrayal that caused it, the image of Nola's face on Amber Alert screens, a symbol once meant to inspire hope, became, for many, a haunting reminder of deceit. The Nola Dinkins case shattered public trust in one of the nation's most sacred emergency systems. An Amber Alert designed to save a child's life had been weaponized by a mother to cover her own crime. It forced communities and agencies alike to confront a disturbing question. How do you protect the innocent when evil learns to mimic innocence so convincingly? The moral weight of this story lies not only in Randall's violence, but in Britton's silence. He didn't strike the blows, but his willingness to hide the body and help sustain the lie made him complicit in every second of Nola's erasure. In domestic abuse cases, silence is not neutrality, it is participation. His inaction sealed her fate as much as the beating that killed her. Today, both Randall and Britton await justice. But for Nola's family, no sentence can replace what was lost. Her story stands as a painful warning that child abuse often hides behind closed doors, behind smiling faces and ordinary routines. It challenges us to pay attention to the unexplained bruises, to the fear in a child's eyes, to the silence that should never feel normal. Nola's short life must not be remembered only for how it ended, but for what it can still change. Her story is a call to vigilance, a reminder that every community shares a responsibility to protect its children. If you suspect abuse, if something doesn't feel right, speak up. Contact your local authorities. For Nola, there are no second chances, but through awareness and courage, her story can ensure that another child doesn't become a headline or a hashtag. Nola's name deserves to be remembered not for deception, but for awakening a truth we can no longer ignore, that silence kills and protection begins when we choose to act. Case 2, the Zona Byrd case, a partnership of fatal neglect. In October 2024, flashing police lights painted the narrow street of Aiken Street in East Baltimore. The call for help hadn't come from a panicked parent, but from an aunt who had discovered something unspeakable inside the family home. When officers entered the residence, they were met with silence. No cries, no movement, just the faint hum of a refrigerator and the stillness of tragedy. In the small bedroom, 5-year-old Zona Byrd lay lifeless in her bed. She was cold to the touch, her tiny frame motionless beneath a thin blanket. The sight was not of a child who had passed suddenly, but of one who had been fading away for months, starving in plain sight. Paramedics rushed to check for signs of life, but there were none. Zona was gone, her body weighing just 17.5 pounds, the average weight of an 18-month-old toddler. The horror deepened with every detail. Zona's ribs were visible, her eyes sunken, and her clothing hung loose on her emaciated body. Nearby, her 6-year-old brother was found weak, malnourished, and barely able to stand. The house contained food, shelves stocked with cans, boxes, and bread, but none of it had reached the children. Detectives quickly realized that this was not a case of poverty. It was a deliberate and sustained act of neglect. Zona hadn't died overnight. She had been slowly starved to death by the 2 people entrusted to protect her, her parents, Bernice and Gerald Byrd. When investigators began questioning the couple, the interviews revealed a chilling indifference. Neither parent could remember the last time they had seen Zona eat, speak, or even move. Their answers weren't defensive. They were vacant, as though the concept of care had long since vanished from their lives. Gerald made a statement that turned the stomachs of seasoned detectives. He said the surviving children had resorted to rummaging through garbage for food. That single detail cut through every excuse. This wasn't neglect born from ignorance. It was a choice. Their silence was the crime. The autopsy confirmed what officers already knew. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner ruled Zona's death a homicide caused by malnutrition and neglect. The medical findings documented months of starvation. Her body showed no recent injuries, only the devastating signs of long-term deprivation. The evidence told a silent story. No bruises, no struggle, just the body of a child systematically denied the one thing she needed most: food. It was a slow, invisible kind of murder that unfolded in plain sight behind the doors of an ordinary home. The background of the Byrd family painted an even darker picture. In 2019, Gerald Byrd had pleaded guilty to assaulting another daughter, a prior warning that should have triggered permanent intervention. Yet the system allowed the family to stay together. Years later, that same oversight would cost Zona her life. Investigators discovered that social services had made prior visits to the home, but no long-term monitoring occurred. The case became a symbol of Maryland's growing crisis. Child welfare agencies stretched thin, overwhelmed, and unable to catch the warning signs until it was too late. Prosecutors wasted no time bringing charges. Both Bernice and Gerald Byrd were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and first-degree child abuse resulting in death. Court documents describe their actions not as isolated negligence, but as a shared pattern of cruelty. When presented with a plea deal in early 2025, both refused. They showed no emotion, no acknowledgement of guilt, only the same blank expressions they had when detectives first arrived. It was as if the humanity had drained from them as completely as the life had drained from their daughter. The community reaction was one of outrage and disbelief. Neighbors on Aiken Street couldn't understand how the signs went unnoticed. One woman who had seen the children occasionally playing outside said, "You could tell something wasn't right, but we never thought it was this bad." Vigils were held outside the Byrd home, where candles flickered beneath pictures of Zona's smiling face. A small teddy bear sat beside the front door, a quiet symbol of the childhood she never got to finish. As the case made headlines, it forced Maryland to confront its own failures. The Zona Byrd case exposed how deep the cracks in the system had become. Journalists uncovered that the state ranked among the highest in the nation for child maltreatment fatalities. Lawmakers began calling for reforms to strengthen oversight, promising that Zona's death would not be ignored. But for many, those promises came too late. The tragedy of Zona's death lies not only in her starvation, but in the shared indifference that killed her. Her parents did not act alone. They acted together, choosing silence over compassion, neglect over nurture. Their inaction was their weapon, their partnership the instrument of her death. Zona's story is a reminder that cruelty does not always come with bruises. Sometimes it comes in the form of empty plates and closed doors. Today, both Bernice and Gerald Byrd remain behind bars, awaiting trial, facing the possibility of life in prison. But for the people of Baltimore, justice cannot fill the void left by a child who never got to live beyond 5 years. Her story continues to echo through the city, urging vigilance, compassion, and responsibility. Zona Byrd's name must never be forgotten. Her short life, defined by starvation and silence, is now a rallying cry for awareness. If you ever suspect a child is being neglected or mistreated, speak up. Every report could save a life. Zona's story is proof that neglect kills and silence helps it grow. Let her legacy be the reason we choose to act before another child is lost to the quiet horror of unseen cruelty. Case 3. The Isolation Chamber. Homicide. Cynthia and Dominique Moore. The first officers arriving at the suburban Montgomery Village home in May 2022 expected a medical emergency. Instead, they stepped into a nightmare. The air was thick with the stench of decay, animal feces, and garbage. Every surface was buried under filth. In the middle of this chaos lay a 17-year-old girl, motionless on the living room floor. Her body was frail, her skin pale and tight over her bones. Weighing only 79 pounds, she had been dying in plain sight. What they uncovered wasn't a scene of sudden violence. It was years of cruelty, hidden behind the walls of a quiet Maryland home. The horror deepened when they learned that this wasn't an isolated incident. 7 children had been living in those conditions, completely cut off from the world. The victim was a disabled teenager who suffered from multiple sclerosis. Her name was withheld in early reports to protect her surviving siblings, but what mattered most was how she lived and how she died. Dependent on her parents for food, care, and medical treatment, she had been left to waste away on a filthy blanket while her parents prayed over her failing body. Her parents, Cynthia and Dominique Moore, claimed that prayer was their medicine and that faith would heal her. In truth, their faith had become the weapon of her destruction. She died not from her illness, but from a complete absence of compassion and care. When investigators questioned the couple, they found themselves confronting a tangle of lies and contradictions. Dominique Moore was the one who called 911, telling dispatchers his daughter had stopped breathing, but the evidence didn't match his words. The house itself was a monument to neglect. Bathrooms that no longer functioned, rotten food piled in the kitchen, and rooms so filthy investigators described them as unfit for human life. The other children were severely malnourished, covered in scabs and sores, terrified to speak. None of them had attended school or seen a doctor in years. The Moores presented themselves as devout and devoted, but their home was a prison of starvation and psychological control. It didn't take long for the deeper truth to surface. Family members told police that the couple had become consumed by a dark religious belief system. They convinced themselves their children were possessed by demons, and that isolation was the only way to protect them from the outside world. The grandmother later testified that her daughter and son-in-law had turned their home into an exorcism chamber, cutting ties with friends, schools, and family. They stopped seeking medical care, ignored social services, and refused any outside help. In their twisted faith, suffering became sanctified. The medical examiner's report shattered any lingering illusions. The 17-year-old's death was ruled a homicide caused by malnutrition and pneumonia brought on by chronic neglect. Her autopsy painted a portrait of extreme deprivation, muscle loss, dehydration, and untreated sores, consistent with being left immobile for months. The surviving siblings provided haunting testimony, how they were forbidden from speaking to outsiders, punished for asking for food, and told that obedience would bring divine healing. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the contrast between Cynthia Moore's social media posts and reality. Online, she shared smiling photos of healthy-looking children. In person, those same children were skeletal, filthy, and starving. Prosecutors charged both parents with second-degree murder and multiple counts of child neglect, arguing that their actions and inactions were so extreme they constituted deliberate cruelty. The courtroom became a battleground between faith and accountability. The defense argued that the couple suffered from mental illness and were overwhelmed. The prosecution's narrative was far more damning. This was not confusion or delusion. It was calculated isolation and control. The Moores had weaponized both religion and fear to justify their actions. In the end, both faced justice. Dominique Moore accepted a plea deal, admitting to child neglect and receiving 7 years in prison. Cynthia Moore fought the charges but was convicted by a jury on 6 counts of child neglect and sentenced to 21 years behind bars. During sentencing, Judge Christopher Fogelman called the case a tragedy of control, isolation, and cowardice, telling the court, "You watched your daughter die in front of you. That was not faith, that was cruelty." The surviving children were placed in state custody, where they began the slow process of healing. Social workers described them as shy, anxious, and malnourished, but slowly improving. They were learning to trust adults again, to eat regularly, to live without fear. They are the silent witnesses to the years of torment that claimed their sister's life. The Cynthia and Dominique Moore case shattered the illusion that child neglect is confined to poverty or chaos. This happened in a suburban neighborhood, a middle-class family with a car in the driveway and curtains drawn tight. It was a crime of control, not desperation. The Moores used isolation as a weapon, cutting their children off from every possible source of help. Their story forces the public to confront an uncomfortable truth. Neglect is not always passive. It can be active, coordinated, and deliberate, fueled by distorted belief and shared cruelty. The lesson left behind is devastating but vital. When families disappear behind silence, when children are unseen for months or years, danger grows in the dark. Neighbors, teachers, and relatives must learn to look beyond politeness and privacy when something feels wrong. Isolation is not faith. Starvation is not care. Silence is not protection. The legacy of this case is a moral demand to act, to intervene, and to speak up when the signs of neglect are visible but ignored. If you ever suspect that a child is being denied food, care, or medical attention, call your local authorities. One call can save a life. The Moores' story proves that even in a quiet suburban home, cruelty can thrive unseen. Their daughter's death must serve as a warning that isolation kills and vigilance saves lives. Case 4. The Lothian Love Triangle Murders, and Anastasi. In the quiet town of Lothian, Maryland, open fields framed the peaceful neighborhood where the Anastasi family lived, a husband, wife, and 5 children, in what seemed like an ordinary suburban home. But on the early evening of October 5th, 2015, a chilling 911 call shattered that peace forever. On the line was 42-year-old Anne-Marie Anastasi, her voice trembling as she told dispatchers she'd just returned home to find her husband dead. "My husband, he shot himself," she said, crying as she described the scene inside their bedroom. She told the operator she'd been out running errands all day and came home to discover her husband's lifeless body. When police arrived at the 2-story home on West Bay Front Road, they found 40-year-old Anthony Anastasi Jr. lying on the bed, fatally shot in the head. A .45 caliber handgun lay beside him. It looked at first like a tragic suicide, but as investigators moved deeper into the house, the story darkened. Down in the basement, officers made a second horrifying discovery. There, lying amid signs of struggle, was 25-year-old Jacqueline Riggs, stabbed more than 40 times. Blood covered the walls and floor. The contrast was startling. One victim shot cleanly in the head, the other brutally butchered. It didn't take long for detectives to realize something was very wrong. The gun found beside Anthony didn't match the bullet in his body. The fatal round was a .380 caliber, not a .45. Gunshot residue was later found on Anne's hands and clothing, though she claimed she hadn't fired a weapon. The so-called suicide scene was fake, a cover-up for cold, premeditated murder. As police pieced together the relationships inside that house, they uncovered a disturbing truth. Years earlier, while living in Michigan, Anne and Anthony had met Jacqueline and entered into a consensual 3-way relationship. When the couple later moved to Maryland, Anthony invited Jacqueline to live with them. He set her up in the basement, and though Anne initially agreed, she soon regretted it. She told her husband she wanted it to stop. He refused. He kept seeing Jacqueline behind her back, often leaving the marital bed at night to sleep downstairs. Friends and relatives said Anne's resentment grew quietly, festering into something dark. Anne later told police that her husband was controlling and emotionally abusive, but investigators and prosecutors saw another story, one of jealousy, humiliation, and revenge. The breaking point came when Anne overheard Anthony and Jacqueline talking about having a baby together. To her, that wasn't just betrayal, it was replacement. That single conversation became the spark that turned her anger into action. Instead of walking away, Anne chose destruction. She confided in her 13-year-old daughter and the girl's 18-year-old boyfriend, Gabriel Struss, telling them Anthony was abusive and needed to be stopped. Court documents would later show that Anne manipulated both teens, convincing them that killing Anthony and Jacqueline was the only way to protect the family. She picked up Gabriel late on the night of October 4th, handed him a .380 handgun, and gave him instructions. Wait until everyone was asleep, shoot Anthony in the head, then go downstairs and kill Jacqueline. Anne reportedly told Gabriel not to worry if anything went wrong, that her 13-year-old daughter could take the blame. because the system would go easy on a child. That single statement revealed the depth of her calculation. She wasn't just planning a murder. She was planning an escape route built on her own daughter's innocence. Just after midnight, Gabriel carried out her orders. He shot Anthony in the head while he slept, then went to the basement and stabbed Jacqueline again and again. 20 stab wounds, 22 slashes, and an eruption of violence that left even veteran detectives shaken. Upstairs, Anne waited. When the house fell silent, she began to stage the scene. Then, in the early evening, hours after the murders, she picked up the phone and made that now infamous 911 call, the performance that would unravel her entire life. The investigation moved quickly. Forensics didn't lie. The mismatched bullet, the gunshot residue, and digital messages between Anne, her daughter, and Gabriel told the truth. Under questioning, Gabriel confessed. He said Anne had planned everything, supplied the weapon, and promised to protect him after the killings. "She told me what to do," he admitted. "She said he deserved it." Prosecutors called Anne the architect of her own family's destruction. In 2017, she entered an Alford plea, acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict her of 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison, the same as Gabriel Struss. Her 13-year-old daughter was tried separately in juvenile court and spared adult sentencing. During sentencing, the judge said, "Mrs. Anastasi didn't just plan 2 murders. She used her child to carry them out. She destroyed not only 2 lives, but the innocence of her own children." The tragedy that began with that early evening phone call became one of Maryland's most shocking domestic crimes, the Lothian love triangle murders. A story that began with consent ended in control. What started as silence ended in screams. And as shocking as the crime itself was, the lesson it left behind runs deeper. If Anne had spoken up earlier, if she'd walked away instead of turning her pain into vengeance, 2 people would still be alive. And if Anthony had recognized how deeply his choices were wounding his family, perhaps he could have stopped the spiral before it began. This isn't just a cautionary tale about jealousy. It's about communication, pride, and control. A warning to women who suffer quietly and to men who ignore the cracks forming at home, because sometimes silence doesn't keep the peace. It kills it. In the end, the Anastasi home became a house of death, its walls holding the echoes of what pride, betrayal, and unspoken pain can do. Love may have started this story, but silence finished it. And if either one of them, husband or wife, had chosen to speak, listen, or walk away, that 911 call might never have been made. Case 5, Karla Porter Murder for Hire. It was just before dawn on February 28, 2010, when officers arrived at the Hess gas station on Route 40 in Havre de Grace, Maryland. The stillness of early morning was shattered by the sight inside. A man slumped lifeless behind the counter, the metallic scent of gunpowder lingering in the air. William Bill Porter, a 48-year-old father and business owner, had been shot once in the head. To investigators, it looked like a robbery gone wrong. Cash registers stood open, and a gunman was nowhere to be found. But something about the scene felt off. Too controlled, too deliberate. Outside, his wife, Karla Porter, wept hysterically, clutching tissues and gasping for breath. She begged officers to find whoever did this, collapsing dramatically as cameras rolled. She attended his funeral days later, her tears flowing freely, her grief on full display. But behind the mourning widow's performance was the chilling truth. The robbery was staged, the hit was planned, and the grieving wife was the one who ordered her husband's death. Bill Porter had built his reputation as a hard-working man, co-owner of the Hess station, known for helping anyone who needed it. He wasn't wealthy, but he was steady, a man who had built a modest life through long hours and determination. His community saw him as a family man who provided, but those who knew the marriage knew it had soured. Behind closed doors, there were reports of control, arguments, and resentment that had been brewing for years. Karla confided to some that she lived in fear of him. Others saw her as manipulative and volatile. Whether it was fear or fury that drove her, something in her finally snapped. The life that had once been defined by hard work and family became defined by deceit, betrayal, and a single deadly choice. In the beginning, detectives pursued the robbery theory. The idea of a random act of violence was easier to accept than the possibility of betrayal. But as investigators dug deeper, the inconsistencies piled up. Nothing of real value had been taken. Karla's story shifted with every retelling. Her grief was loud, yet strangely hollow. When detectives discovered that she stood to collect more than $500,000 in life insurance, their focus shifted from the unknown gunman to the woman in black who cried the loudest. The trail of evidence led police to a man named Walter Bishop, a 61-year-old handyman who lived nearby, and his son Kendall. When questioned, Bishop's story unraveled quickly. He confessed that Karla Porter had approached him months earlier with a chilling proposition. She wanted her husband dead. For $400 and a used pickup truck, he agreed. She told him exactly when to strike, how to stage it as a robbery, and when she'd be out of the way. As her husband bled out on the floor of their business, Karla was miles away at a hair appointment, calm, poised, and waiting for the call that would make her a widow. The confession cracked the case wide open. Bishop described meetings with Karla, the planning and the cold certainty in her tone. Kendall later corroborated every detail. Forensic records and cell phone data showed Karla contacting Bishop before and after the killing. It was not a crime of passion, it was execution by proxy. When investigators confronted her with the evidence, she denied everything, insisting she had been abused, terrified, and desperate for a way out. She claimed that the murder was not an act of greed, but of survival. But detectives saw no signs of coercion or fear in the months leading up to the killing. They saw calculation, coordination, and profit. In court, the battle became as psychological as it was legal. Prosecutors painted Karla as a woman driven by greed and vengeance, one who viewed murder as the easiest escape from a failing marriage. The defense countered with a portrait of a battered woman trapped in a cycle of emotional and physical abuse who genuinely believed she had no way out. Experts testified about battered woman syndrome, explaining how years of control can warp perception and convince victims that violence is the only escape. But the prosecution had the damning evidence, texts, money trails, and witness testimony that told a different story. It wasn't a moment of panic. It was a plan written down, rehearsed, and carried out. Her conviction was initially overturned on appeal years later, after the court determined that the jury had not been properly instructed on how to interpret her battered woman syndrome defense. It was a rare legal victory, but it did not change the facts. In a retrial, the evidence stood firm. The calls, the cash, the confession, all pointed back to her. In 2017, after years of appeals, Karla Porter was reconvicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Walter Bishop and his son received long sentences of their own. The case became a lesson for both sides of the domestic violence debate. For some, Karla's story was that of a woman pushed beyond her limits, a victim failed by a system that offered no escape. For others, she was a manipulator who weaponized the language of abuse to justify murder. Perhaps if Karla had found the courage to walk away instead of orchestrating revenge, 2 lives might have been spared, and a family wouldn't have been destroyed by silence, fear, and greed. The legacy of the Porter case lingers in Maryland's legal system and beyond. It exposed the fragile line between victimhood and accountability, between desperation and destruction. It showed that fear, when left to fester, can become indistinguishable from hatred, and it forced the community to face a haunting truth. When love becomes a battlefield, No one truly survives. Case 6. The Chainsaw Matricide, the case of Candace Craig. It began on Monday, June 2nd, 2023, when police were dispatched to a modest home in Landover, Maryland, to perform a welfare check on 71-year-old Margaret Craig. Family members had grown worried after days without contact. When officers entered the home, they were met by an unmistakable, suffocating odor, the stench of decomposition. In the basement, detectives found blood, tissue, and 3 large trash bags. Inside one bag, investigators saw what appeared to be brain matter and dismembered human remains. The horror was instant. This was no missing person case. A grandmother had been brutally murdered inside her own home. Margaret Craig was the quiet strength of her family, a retired federal worker who had spent her life caring for others. Her home, supported by her pension and Social Security, had become a refuge for her daughter, 45-year-old Candace Craig, and her 19-year-old granddaughter, Salia Hardy. But Margaret's kindness was repaid with betrayal. The investigation revealed that her death was not an accident or a moment of rage. It was the result of greed, deceit, and the ultimate violation of trust. A daughter killing her mother over money. When questioned, Candace told officers she didn't know where her mother was. But the story unraveled quickly. Detectives discovered that Margaret had confronted Candace days earlier about fraudulent activity on her credit cards and bank accounts. On May 23, 2023, confrontation turned violent. In the middle of an argument, Candace strangled her mother to death. For several days, she hid the body. But when the smell became unbearable, she dragged it to the basement and began a desperate, grotesque cleanup. A few days later, she tried to destroy the evidence, starting a fire and attempting to burn the remains on a backyard barbecue grill. That failed act of concealment would later lead to the discovery that exposed the truth. The hidden danger was not a stranger or intruder, but a multi-generational partnership in crime. Candace enlisted her own daughter, Salia, to help move and dismember the body. As investigators later found, while her mother's remains were being burned, Candace continued accessing Margaret's bank accounts, withdrawing money and making purchases, proof that greed was the true motive. The case broke open when Salia Hardy broke down under questioning. She revealed how her mother had strangled Margaret, then forced her to help cut up the body using a chainsaw. Salia said Candace sent her to buy cleaning supplies and lighter fluid, then made her scrub blood from the walls and floors before trying to burn the remains. Forensic teams confirmed her story. They recovered the electric chainsaw still covered in human tissue, documented extensive blood spatter in the basement, and matched DNA evidence to Margaret Craig. Candace Craig remained defiant, showing no emotion when confronted with her daughter's confession. But the evidence and Salia's testimony told the full story. Prosecutors said Candace forced her daughter to participate to ensure her silence, binding her through trauma and fear. It was the ultimate psychological manipulation, a mother making her child an accomplice in horror. The trial in late 2024 centered on a single narrative: first-degree murder for financial gain. The defense argued mental instability, but jurors rejected it, siding with the prosecution's clear evidence of planning and profit. Candace's ongoing use of her mother's bank accounts after the murder proved she acted not from panic, but from calculation. On February 19, 2025, Judge Kevin J. Wiggins delivered his verdict. Candace Craig was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling her actions the ultimate violation of motherhood. Her daughter, Salia Hardy, received probation after pleading guilty to accessory after the fact and fully cooperating with prosecutors. State's attorney Aisha Braveboy said afterward, "This was a giving, compassionate woman, killed, dismembered, and burned by her own daughter. It is one of the most horrifying acts of betrayal our county has ever seen." The legacy of the Candace Craig case is a warning written in blood and fire, a grim lesson on the dangers of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Margaret Craig's death was not only the murder of a mother, it was the destruction of a family line. Her story forces communities to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the greatest threat to a vulnerable elder is not outside the home, but within it. If you suspect that an older adult is being exploited or abused, speak up. Call the National Elder Abuse Hotline at 1-800-677-1116. Silence protects the abuser. Action protects the innocent. Case 7, the murder of Edward Koza. It was Saturday evening, May 24th, 2025, in Davidsonville, Maryland. The smell of smoke rolled across the quiet parking lot of Tropic Bay Water Gardens, a small local shop owned by 67-year-old Edward Stephen Koza. Firefighters were dispatched to what they thought was a simple car fire. But as they extinguished the flames, they made a discovery that turned an ordinary night into a murder scene. Inside the charred truck, they found the body of a man. His arms and hands were bound with tape, his mouth sealed shut. The medical examiner later confirmed he had also suffered blunt force trauma to the head before the fire. The burning vehicle was his own, and the victim was identified as the shop's owner, Edward Koza. What first appeared to be an accident was now a homicide. Investigators immediately noticed the strong smell of gasoline around the truck. Melted fragments of a plastic fuel container were found inside the back seat. Near the driver's side, detectives spotted something that would soon unravel the entire case. A brand new Bass Pro Shops baseball cap lying on the ground. Inside the garden shop, officers found more signs of violence. Displays were knocked over, shelves were broken, there had been a struggle. Investigators pieced together that Koza was attacked inside his store sometime after closing. He was then restrained, forced into the back seat of his own pickup truck, and left to die. Surveillance footage filled in the missing hours. At around 9 p.m., video from a BP gas station on West Central Avenue showed Koza's truck pulling in. A young woman stepped out from the passenger seat and walked inside the store. Behind the wheel, a young man wearing a flannel shirt and a Bass Pro hat waited. That hat matched the one found at the crime scene. Detectives soon identified the pair. 18-year-old Jonah Michael Poole and his girlfriend, Kylie Alyssa Dakes, both seniors in Anne Arundel County. The evidence told a chilling story. Investigators believe Poole and Dakes attacked Koza around 5:30 p.m. inside his store. They bound him with tape, placed him in the back seat of his truck, and drove to the BP gas station to buy gasoline. That same fuel was later used to ignite the fire that would consume both the vehicle and Koza's body. After setting the blaze, the couple fled in their red Lincoln, the same car caught on camera earlier that day at the Bass Pro Shop near Arundel Mills Mall, where Poole had bought flannel shirts and the baseball cap left behind at the scene. The discovery sent shock waves through the community. Koza was known as a kind, soft-spoken business owner who had run Tropic Bay Water Gardens for years. His death was senseless, brutal, and incomprehensible. Detectives arrested Poole and Dakes days later. Both were charged with first and second-degree murder, assault, conspiracy to commit murder, and arson. Poole was also linked to a burglary at Pirates Cove restaurant just a week earlier, a sign that the couple's descent into violence may have been escalating. Police spokesman Justin Mulcahy said investigators are still searching for the motive. "We just don't know why," he said. "We know there was evidence of a struggle inside the business and surveillance showing the suspects nearby. Based on the totality of the investigation, we feel very strongly that they are responsible for the murder of Mr. Koza." The brutality of this crime stunned even seasoned officers. A respected small business owner, bound inside his own vehicle, set ablaze by teenagers with no clear reason. It is a tragedy that leaves behind no answers, only grief and disbelief. For the people of Davidsonville, Tropic Bay Water Gardens is now a place of mourning, a reminder of how quickly ordinary life can turn into unthinkable horror. Case 8. The Delayed Homicide, Jennifer Espinoza-Orellana. It was a quiet Friday evening on Shady Spring Drive in Gaithersburg, Maryland. The calm was shattered when a 911 call came in about a man bleeding in a parked car. When police arrived, they found 37-year-old Jorge Zavala Marquez slumped in the passenger seat, bleeding heavily from a single stab wound to his chest. His girlfriend, Kenya Espinoza-Orellana, stood nearby, claiming she had been trying to drive him to the hospital. But her story, like the man beside her, was already fading fast. Investigators learned that just minutes earlier, inside their shared apartment, an argument had turned deadly. Espinoza-Orellana had grabbed a kitchen knife during the fight and stabbed Zavala Marquez once in the chest, piercing his lung and heart. The blade strike was fatal, but instead of calling 911, she lied. She told detectives she panicked, that she wanted to take him to the hospital herself, but evidence proved she waited, wasting precious minutes that could have saved his life. Prosecutors later described those moments as deliberate, cold, and devastating. When police questioned her further, her story kept shifting. At first, she said Zavala Marquez had been injured accidentally, then she claimed it was self-defense. But the physical evidence, a clean, direct wound, no defensive marks, no struggle consistent with her account, told a different story. The medical examiner confirmed it was a single, purposeful thrust, not an accident born of panic. Inside the apartment, officers found signs of the argument: a knocked-over chair, traces of blood near the kitchen, and the knife, lying cleanly on the counter, rinsed but not hidden. The investigation revealed that the couple's relationship had been volatile for months, marked by jealousy and constant fighting. Friends described them as inseparable but explosive, a relationship that always seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. In court, prosecutors said Espinoza-Orellana didn't just stab her boyfriend, she watched him die. They emphasized how she delayed calling for help and tried to mislead police to protect herself. Her defense attorneys argued that she acted impulsively during an argument without intent to kill. But the jury saw the pattern, the anger, the lies, and the lack of urgency, and found her guilty of second-degree murder. At sentencing in April of 2025, the courtroom was silent as the judge addressed her. The judge described the killing as a moment of rage that became a permanent loss. Espinoza-Orellana was sentenced to 18 years in prison for the murder of the man she once claimed to love. For the family of Jorge Zavala Marquez, the sentence offered some measure of justice, but little comfort. They remembered him as kind, hardworking, and gentle, a man whose life was cut short by the person he trusted most. The tragedy on Shady Spring Drive stands as a harsh reminder of how quickly anger can destroy everything. Toxic relationships rarely start with violence. They build slowly through control, resentment, and silence. The moment words turn into threats or fear becomes a routine feeling, it's already gone too far. Experts say the most powerful choice anyone can make in that moment is to walk away, to step outside the argument, to seek help, to call a friend, a counselor, or the police before emotions turn lethal. Violence is not resolution. It's a permanent mistake born in seconds of rage. If you or someone you know feels trapped in a toxic or violent relationship, don't stay silent. There is help and there is hope. Contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 or visit thehotline.org. Love should never hurt, and choosing peace, even when it feels impossible, can save not just one life, but two. Case 9, The Caged Children, Paul and Melissa Trapani. It was a cold morning in Westminster, Maryland, when sheriff's deputies arrived at a modest home off Stone Road for a welfare check that would shake even the most seasoned officers. Inside that home, authorities found 6 children living in conditions so deplorable they struggled to describe them in words. The house was filled with filth and decay. The smell of urine and rot hung in the air. Trash, feces, and spoiled food covered the floors. And in one of the rooms, deputies made the discovery that would haunt them: 2 small children locked inside makeshift wooden cages. Investigators later said the cages were crudely built from wooden boards and chicken wire. The children, wearing soiled clothing, had no blankets, no toys, and no way to get out. In another part of the home, other children sat on bare mattresses surrounded by garbage, showing clear signs of neglect and malnourishment. The parents, Paul and Melissa Trapani, were inside the home. Both appeared calm as deputies questioned them. They admitted to using the cages, claiming it was a way to keep the children safe while they did chores. But authorities quickly dismissed that excuse. What they saw wasn't safety. It was confinement, humiliation, and cruelty. The children, ranging from ages 3 to 16, were immediately removed from the home and taken into protective custody. Medical evaluations confirmed what investigators already feared. The children were suffering from neglect, poor nutrition, and untreated health conditions. Neighbors told reporters they rarely saw the children outside. Some had noticed strange sounds from the house, but few imagined the horror inside. The case sent shockwaves through Carroll County, sparking outrage, disbelief, and sorrow. When questioned, the Trappanists gave conflicting statements. They claimed they were overwhelmed, that the children had behavioral issues, that they did their best. But investigators said this was not a case of parents struggling with poverty or stress. It was willful neglect. The home had electricity, food, and resources. What it lacked was compassion. In court, the Trappanists faced multiple charges of child abuse and neglect. They eventually pleaded guilty to several counts, avoiding a full trial. Prosecutors detailed the disturbing reality: 2 children locked in cages for hours, others left in filth, and all deprived of basic care and dignity. During sentencing, the judge's voice was steady but heavy with emotion. He told the parents, "You didn't just fail to provide for your children, you stripped them of their humanity." Paul and Melissa Trapani were sentenced to 10 years in prison, with 5 years suspended and 5 years of supervised probation upon release. They were also barred from contact with the children unless approved by social services. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was handed down. For those children, the damage was already done: the lost years, the fear, the trauma. But the hope, authorities said, was that they could now begin to heal. This case is more than a story of neglect. It's a warning, a reminder that silence is dangerous. Too often, children live behind closed doors in conditions no one wants to imagine. Experts urge every community member to take action when something feels wrong. If a child seems constantly afraid, hungry, or unkempt, it may be a sign of deeper trouble. Reporting concerns doesn't ruin lives, it can save them. If you suspect a child is being neglected or abused, call 1-800-422-4453 or contact your local child protective services. Children can't always speak for themselves. It's up to us, neighbors, teachers, friends, to be their voice. Because sometimes one phone call is the difference between continued suffering and a second chance at life. Case 10, The Power Grid Conspiracy, Brandon Russell and Sarah Clendaniel. It began in secret, in encrypted chats filled with hate and obsession. 2 extremists, one in Maryland and one in Florida, quietly plotted to cripple an entire city. Their plan wasn't to steal or to protest, it was to destroy. The targets were the electrical substations that powered the Baltimore metropolitan area. Their goal was simple and horrifying: to plunge hundreds of thousands of people into darkness, chaos, and fear. The conspirators were 29-year-old Brandon Russell, a neo-Nazi leader and co-founder of the violent extremist group Atomwaffen Division, and 34-year-old Sarah Beth Clendaniel of Maryland. Their conversations revealed a calculated plan, not a fantasy, but a blueprint for domestic terrorism. They wanted to destroy Baltimore's power grid, believing that it would completely destroy this whole city. It was an act born from ideology, hatred, and delusion. Brandon Russell, trained as an engineer and already known to federal authorities for his extremist activities, provided the technical expertise. He guided Clendaniel on how to strike specific substations and cause what he called a cascading failure, a chain reaction that could shut down power for weeks across the East Coast. Sarah Clendaniel, who was terminally ill, said she wanted to make a statement before she died. Together, they built a plan that mixed desperation with hate, a dangerous combination that could have led to mass suffering. But what they didn't know was that the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force was already watching. For months, undercover agents infiltrated their communications, tracking every message, every map, every diagram. Agents monitored as the pair discussed weapons, identified vulnerable substations, and exchanged guides on how to damage key infrastructure. What began as encrypted online chatter evolved into a concrete operational plan. In February 2023, before they could act, federal agents moved in. Brandon Russell and Sarah Clendaniel were arrested and their homes searched and their electronic devices seized. Investigators recovered evidence confirming their intent: detailed maps, extremist writings, and digital traces of the entire plot. The arrests likely prevented one of the most devastating domestic terror attacks in Maryland's history. In court, Russell showed little remorse. His defense claimed his words were nothing more than extremist talk, a fantasy born from ideology, not a genuine plan. But prosecutors argued the evidence spoke for itself. The materials, the coordination, and the level of detail proved intent. They made it clear that this was not speculation. It was a plan that could have caused catastrophic damage to hospitals, businesses, and homes, leaving thousands vulnerable in freezing temperatures. Prosecutor Eric Barron summarized it best. This wasn't about power lines. It was about hate. The goal was terror, and we will not tolerate anyone who weaponizes ideology to threaten the safety of our communities. On August 7, 2025, federal judge Theodore Chuang sentenced Brandon Russell to 20 years in federal prison. His co-conspirator, Sarah Clendaniel, later pleaded guilty and awaits sentencing. The sentence marked one of the harshest in recent years for a domestic terrorism plot targeting critical infrastructure. Federal investigators said that if the attack had succeeded, it could have left hundreds of thousands without electricity for weeks, causing widespread panic and loss of life. The potential devastation underscored how fragile and vital America's infrastructure remains, and how extremist ideologies can weaponize that fragility. Experts in counterterrorism have since called this case a wake-up call, showing how online hate networks can quickly translate into real-world threats. Brandon Russell's background in engineering made the plot even more dangerous. Knowledge, once meant to build, was instead turned toward destruction. The power grid conspiracy reminds us that the battle against extremism is not only fought on the streets, but also in the digital spaces where hate festers. It is a warning about what happens when ideology becomes obsession, when words turn into weapons. As one FBI agent said after the sentencing, "The light that keeps a city alive is more than electricity. It's unity, compassion, and vigilance. We can't let hate be the thing that turns it off." If any of these stories moved you, let them be more than moments of shock. Let them be lessons. Every crime began with a choice, and every tragedy was a warning ignored. As a community, we can choose awareness over apathy, compassion over silence, and prevention over regret. To everyone who believed in us enough to watch this far, thank you. Your time, your attention, and your empathy help keep these stories alive, and a special appreciation goes to the investigators, prosecutors, and everyday citizens who refused to look away, who fought to bring truth, accountability, and justice to light. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Together, we can raise awareness, spark change, and prevent the next tragedy. If you believe in justice, truth, and the power of community, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that remind us what's at stake when humanity forgets its own heart.